when the Reds returned back into the train depot in Cincinnati, and individuals began to disembark from the train, they saw a couple of young strapping gentlemen carrying bags, walking off, and people panicked. So they realized those were the Pullman porters. And they saw the Cubans gathered with everybody else, and it was like, oh, okay, it's safe. Pullman porters were all African American. And that was the worry. It's like, oh my God, they had to let these black players in. Oh my God, they did this. And then it's like, oh no, okay. But this is why this article was necessary in the Cincinnati Enquirer. Because people were worried that Cubans, for the most part, were not perceived as fellow whites, that you had to show they came from the highest ethnic group or racial stock. And in this case, it was Castilian. Now here's part of, to me, the irony of Castilian soap. In Cincinnati, it's the home of Procter & Gamble. And the old pitch line for Ivory soap is 99 and 44.1% pure. Well, they're trying to convey that these are pure, white, just like Ivory soap. Well, in reality, Castilian soap is a very dark brown, if not black. So here we have what I call about the manipulation of racial knowledge. You know, fans, they would think of soap as white, and therefore this would help them think they're white. And ironically, in fact, they're talking about these guys were black. So it just goes to show you how the knowledge about race is very much set upon its context. Now, two of these gentlemen, and I don't have a pointer, so I'll do it the old-fashioned way. In the center is Alex Pompez. He's the subject of my next book, and which will be out in May. The gentleman to his left is Joe Cambria. And these two individuals were the ones who were the most active in bringing Latin American players into the major leagues. If you can look closely, you'll notice behind them that everyone's black. They're actually at a Richmond Braves minor league game. They're seated at the very front of what was called the colored section. But Joe Cambria is Italian, and Alex Pompez is an Afro-Cuban American. And Cambria worked as the scout for the Washington Senators. And what the Washington Senators did is they brought in the greatest number of Latin American talent into the major leagues prior to the signing of Jackie Robinson. They actively sought Latino players, and they sought to acquire them on the cheap. I argue they were the first to engage in this practice of Latino players on the cheap. The Senators basically promised these players a tryout, and they paid for a one-way ticket from Cuba, where the majority of these Latino players were coming from, to the United States, where the Senators were having spring trainings. If they made it, they got a minor league contract. If they didn't, good luck getting back to Cuba. For what came to about $75, that's what the Senators were investing in each Cuban prospect that they signed. However, Cambria had another deal on the side. If any of those players actually got a contract, then he would get a bonus, a certain cut of the signing of the player. And so he had a natural incentive to sign as many players as possible. After all, they're only paying $75 a player. So that these players, the more that make it into the minor leagues and even into the major leagues, the more money he earns. And so Cambria worked the sugar leagues of Cuba. And he found a lot of prospects. And a few of them made it into the major leagues. But he and Alex Pompez also collaborated in a number of instances, where Alex Pompez, who owned a Negro League baseball team called the New York Cubans, previously called the Cuban Stars, would find a player, and these two guys would talk. And they're like, you know, you think he can make it? And in a couple instances, Pompez says, you sign him. And they snuck a player, a Cuban player, into the minor leagues, and a couple of them actually make it into the major leagues. And, you know, the racial ancestry would be somewhat, you know, suspect. And of those players who did get into the major leagues out of Cuba, the one that raised the most suspicion and received the most attention was Roberto Estaleja. Now, I know some of you may or may not have heard of the show called Maury. That show by Maury Povich, Shirley Povich is his father. And I'm sure he rolls over in his grave every time the show comes on. But Shirley Povich wrote for the Washington Post for decades. He had the DC beat, he covered baseball, and he was a great columnist. Povich spoke oftentimes with, I would say, a much more progressive tone in his columns than most other sports writers of his era. Here he's talking about the reception of other major league players towards Roberto Estaleja. And he talks about these 200% Americans who resent the presence of the Cuban ball players. Again, this is all before Jackie Robinson. Particularly the swarthy ones, like Estaleja. Well, so the next two bullet points point you towards two of Estaleja's teammates and what they remember and what they said. John Wallach talks about, or maybe it's Walla, I'm sorry, I'm not up on my Polish. He noted that most of their teammates on the 1939 team saw Estela and the other Cuban players as black, and they treated them as such. Now remember, DC is this funky place because federal buildings are mostly integrated, there's access, but local buildings are segregated. Local restaurants, it's up to the proprietor to whether or not they segregate. And when they're saying that they treated their players, their Cuban teammates as such, as black, that means they're treating them so that they would have to deal with the reality of segregation when they're traveling through the United States, when they're going around DC, when they're headed off to St. Louis. Now, Ossie Bluge, he remembered some of the opponents and how he treated. And I won't read it, but you can see that last line about you might be Cuban, but you're still, So the racial hostility was still there. Part of the story here is inclusion did not mean necessarily equality. Inclusion, and particularly under the terms under which these Cubans were being included. See, the Washington Senators, and I had it up on the last slide, they brought a lot of these Cuban players in, particularly during World War II. As U.S.-born individuals went off to fight in the war, enlisted in the military, or went into defense plant work, the Senators went crazy going into Cuba and getting these players. And at one point, the Senators, at spring training, out of the 40 major league players or prospects they had, 23 of them were Cuban. And so other teams protested, like, the Senators gone too far.